Hi, I'm Tim Barton.
And I'm Jonathan Ritchie.
We're back on The American Story, and we're here in the American Journey Experience Vault, where we've been going through original artifacts and learning some of the history of America by these actual artifacts. And Jonathan, as we've been diving into some of these artifacts, we started first with the discovery of America by Columbus, walking through his story to Jamestown, the first major English colony, to Plymouth, to then other colonies developing, and even the ideas that shaped kind of the formation, the foundation that led to the American Revolution, America becoming a free, independent state. And in the midst of that, we talked about some of the pastors who were involved and some of the things they did that were incredibly influential. We got into a little bit of the political philosophy, and this is really where you see some of the application of those ideas from early pastors, specifically as some of the politics are unfolding with Great Britain.
That's right. Now we're on the road to revolution. And a lot of kind of the immediate political things that led to the outbreak of the Revolutionary War go back to the French and Indian War that happened a few decades earlier. And the idea behind that conflict was, obviously the English are not the only people in the New World, especially North America. And so you have a lot of French colonies that are up in Canada and on the other side of the Mississippi and Ohio. And so the English frontier and the French frontier are in conflict, right? England and France have been enemies for hundreds of years at this point, and so it's no surprise that eventually conflict breaks out. It turns into a major theater of war. It goes on for many years. Some very notable American figures actually get kind of their first experience in life, leading men, leading kind of these movements. Notably, George Washington, actually, he volunteers in the Virginia militia, fights underneath the British during this, is very influential in actually rescuing a significant portion of the British Army after a general kind of led them into an ambush. Washington is actually then highlighted by some of the pastors as somebody to even follow in the next few years as he continues to grow as leader.
Yeah, one of the pastors from that first Great Awakening era was Samuel Davies. Samuel Davies was a major leader in Virginia, and we identified there were multiple pastors involved in the first Great Awakening, very significant figures. Samuel Davies actually identified George Washington because one of the accounts that comes back from this battle, it was the Battle of the Monongahela, where the English are ambushed by French and Indians, and there's a lot of kind of silly things surrounding the British, where the British officer, General Braddock, had kind of refused to send scouts ahead, thinking we're too big, we're too powerful, right? The French and Indians can't overwhelm us. We don't need to know where they are. And they end up getting ambushed, and in the ambush, General Braddock dies, and every single officer got shot down off horseback except George Washington, even though he had a couple horses shot out from under him. When he is now the last surviving officer on horseback, he leads the retreat back to the fort. When he got back to the fort, he took off his jacket, and there were actually bullet holes through his jacket. So the story goes out about George Washington miraculously surviving this attack. And this is when Samuel Davies, he writes a sermon dealing with war and kind of Christians' role or job in war. And he identifies George Washington in the midst of this sermon.
This is actually that sermon right here, Tim. It was preached in 1755, and it's titled Religion and Patriotism, the Constituents of a Good Soldier. And in it, he's talking about, obviously, the duties and obligations of Christians on the battlefield, what they need to do, how they should treat the enemy, captives, all sorts of things. But he notes how God's providence is particularly evident sometimes in the heat of battle when people are spared. And he makes a note, and he says, as a remarkable instance of this, I may point out to the public that heroic youth, Colonel Washington, whom I cannot but hope Providence has hitherto preserved in so signal a manner for some important service to his country. This is kind of just cool to know because obviously Washington, like you mentioned, had survived. In fact, without even being wounded, he began to grow this reputation of almost being bulletproof. Some of the Native Americans who were fighting with the French actually had legends about Washington from this battle where they said, Washington was a man that God had ordained that he would not be able to die by a bullet. I mean, some really cool things, but you start to see from this French and Indian War, and eventually the British, come out on top. They're able to recover from this setback and really settle things in their favor, but it cost a lot of money for the English. And so at this point, the king and parliament start passing laws to tax the colonies directly. And this is a pretty major shift. And many of the colonists, having been raised upon sermons about, what is the proper role of government, how it's supposed to do, local sovereignty, the consent of the governed, they recognize, wait a second, we don't have any representation in the English Parliament. And like the sermons from John Wise, you can't really have taxation without representation. And so they start pushing back very strongly against these usurpations by the British Parliament.
And this is also where, as we're mentioning, kind of this political movement where the biblical teachings meet the political culture. As you identified, they actually start standing up based on what they've learned from Scripture, saying you're not supposed to do that. And of course, people have probably heard of the Stamp Act, the stamp tax, paper coming in would have the stamp on it. And this is something that they basically said, okay, we're not doing this, led to kind of an open revolt on some level. There was enough pushback that the British said, okay, right, we're not trying to start a war with you yet. But in the midst of this, they said, okay, we'll repeal that. But just so there's no confusion.
Yeah, just so there's no confusion, they pass this law right here. This is a printing in 1766 of what's known today as the Retaliatory Act, but literally the language is that the American colonies are dependent upon it. It's obviously the very opposite of independence. It is recognizing their dependency upon the British, and that's literally the whole purpose of the law. It's like, hey, sure, we repealed the Stamp Act because y'all threw such a fit about it, but don't be confused here. We basically own you, and we're able to tell you whatever it is that we want, and you have to do it. And so this issue is not resolved, and in the coming years, these tensions continue to kind of be packed together, and it's kind of an explosive situation in the colonies as pertaining to their relation with England.
And this is something that, as you look at this kind of declaratory act where they come out and say, hey, we're still in charge, we're still the boss, this is where you start to see in colonies the buildup of tension, where even in Massachusetts, where when the king is now passing things, their parliament is passing things, the State Assembly of Massachusetts came out and said, we don't support what you do, and they come out with a statement against it. And the royal appointed governor said, you're going to have to take that back. And the State Assembly in Massachusetts actually votes overwhelming majority. It was like 92-17, some huge number where they said, we're not taking back the statement. We stand by this. Yeah. At this point, the Crown and the royal appointed governor, they actually eliminate the state legislative body for Massachusetts and say, okay, y'all don't get to officially be a party anymore. And they begin taking over power, seizing in a tyrannical fashion, saying we're now your boss officially. Like we kind of let you be your own for a little bit, but it's like mom and dad, right? We're back in charge. We're locking you in your room. And they decided that in the midst of this, what would help people of Massachusetts know that they were really the ones in charge was, let's move some of our military into Boston. So let's move some of these units in, and because then if we have this really strong military presence, they're going to know, hey, we don't want to mess with the British government because they're so big, they're so strong. But it actually was a setup for something that ends up not going well, and actually is the spark that began the American Revolution.